Hello again, and welcome to part two of this introduction to the Bible. Hopefully this one will be fairly short. We're just going to look at the 66 books of the Bible and how they're broken down into different sections. And we'll take just a minute and look at the difference in the order of the books from the Old Testament, from the Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition. So the Old Testament. The order of the books is different in the Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition, and we'll look at that just in a minute. And it wasn't until the 2nd century AD that the order became an issue, and that was partly because of the way things were kept and recorded. Up until that time, most of or nearly all of the text was kept on scrolls. And of course, if it's on a scroll, you can just put the scrolls in, sure they were in an order, but they weren't in a book. And so once you put all those things in a book, then you have to decide what's going to be the beginning, what's going to be the end, and then all the stuff in the order in the middle. And we already mentioned last week that the order was different, indicating that 2nd Chronicles was the last book in the Old Testament, according to the Jewish tradition that Jesus knew when he was walking the earth. When the Codex form appeared, as we said, the order became important. The Old Testament tells the story of God's people from creation until about the year 400 BC. Now, if you read some commentaries, you're going to find out that some people believe, and maybe rightly so, but some people believe that some of the Old Testament was written much later than that. There is another set of material that we're not going to discuss in this introduction called the Apocrypha, and that very much covers that time period from about 400 BC after Jerusalem was rebuilt up until and even through the time of Christ. The Old Testament was written over the course of about 1,000 years, from about 1400 BC until about 400 BC. Those dates are very much open for debate, but that's a rough estimate. Written by at least 30 writers. Many of them are unknown to us. It was written in Hebrew, and if you see the graphic over here with the list of the books of the Old Testament on it, you will see that those are the Hebrew names there that are listed. It was written in Hebrew. A few of the texts were written in Aramaic. For folks like me and you, just looking at it, we're not going to be able to tell the difference between Hebrew and Aramaic. Very, very similar. I don't think it's quite like this, but it's very much like the similarity perhaps between Latin and Italian. Very, very similar languages. So the Hebrew order of the Old Testament is like this. Begins just the same with the law. And when we read about the law in the New Testament, this is the section of Scripture that is referenced. If it's talking about Scripture, there's another way that the term the law was used in the New Testament, which had to do with the way people understood the law, meaning all the stuff that the Pharisees had added to it. But this is the law: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And then the former prophets. This is called history, according to the way I learned it growing up. But the former prophets: Joshua, Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. And then the later prophets: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then the book of the 12. And the book of the 12 includes all of what we would call the minor prophets: Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And then the last section is the writings, which is the Psalms, Proverbs, Ruth, Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, Lamentations, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Now you'll notice in the list, at least this is a list that I grew up with, several of those books are in what we would call the history section, You'll also notice that Lamentations and Daniel, which are attached to what we might call the major prophets, there are considered in the writings. And Daniel is a very different kind of book than the prophets Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. But in the Hebrew order of things, this is the way it was put together. Now, the Christian order of the Old Testament is different. The law is the same: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But then we get to the history part, and we have Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and then added to that is 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Now, Kings and Chronicles cover basically the same time frame, and then Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther all have to do with either the captivity in Babylon or the return from the captivity in Babylon. So they are legitimately part of what we would call history. And then the poetic books. We'll spend quite a bit of time talking about Hebrew poetry, but at least, and certainly the Psalms. The poetry is Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon. Each one of those is a slightly different set of literature. Job is a long, epic poem. Psalms, of course, we're very familiar with, as we are with Proverbs. Ecclesiastes is very practical wisdom. It's a book that I've learned to appreciate more and more as I've gotten older. And then the Song of Solomon, which is somewhat controversial because it's basically a love poem and it's fairly graphic in places. In fact, it was banned from reading by the Puritans. They didn't want anybody reading it. And it's also been very much allegorized as a relationship of Christ and the church. Of course, when it was written, it really couldn't have been that because it was written so long before. But anyway, that's another discussion. But that, and the rest of the Old Testament here, we have the major prophets: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel, and then the minor prophets, which makes up that book of the 12 that we just looked at a minute ago: Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And perhaps with the exception of Jonah, those are roughly in chronological order. Zechariah and Malachi are what we would call post-exilic prophets. Haggai is right in there too, the time after the exile, after all the disaster happened. These prophets came in and helped the people to rebuild. And then the New Testament. The New Testament is a collection of writings that came to be considered authoritative for the church's teaching. We talked about that a little bit in the introductory lesson. The word canon is also used to describe its function because it is the authority for our faith and practice. Most Christian denominations restrict their authoritative texts to the 27 books of the New Testament. And that's that word canon that is important there. These books were widely distributed and quoted by the early church fathers as conveying the apostolic teaching and authority. So one of the tests for whether or not a book got in the New Testament was could the authority of that teaching be traced back to the apostles? And so does it agree with the apostles' teaching? And that's what we mean by that. It was the Council of Carthage in 397 that the church decided that our current 27 writings were to be included and all others excluded. And so you can see there, that's 300 and something years after most of these books were written, that the church finally settled and said, these are the ones that we are going to consider authoritative. So the first 3 centuries of the church were fascinating times, and people were still trying to figure out just exactly what the teachings of Jesus were. And I would say that we're still having those discussions today, even though we've pretty much concluded on these, decided on these 27 books. The content of the New Testament is the ministry and teachings of Jesus in 4 accounts known as the Gospels. Acts is a continuation of the story that was begun in the Gospel of Luke, and it tells about the church spreading through the empire. And the basic movement of Acts is how the church moved from Jerusalem to Rome. And of course, Rome was the most important city in the world at that time, at least in the world that would have been known to the New Testament writers. The last book in the New Testament is an apocalyptic writing that we call Revelation. The remaining books of the New Testament are letters and sermons addressing the challenges that the church faced as it tried to live according to the teaching of Jesus. Every letter in the New Testament was written for a reason. It was written to address a particular problem. And once you get your head around that, then it helps us to understand better the content of those letters. And so for the books of the New Testament, the order of the books, the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. If you're familiar with the Bible at all, you will be familiar with these 4 books, followed by what some call a book of history, which is Acts. It is actually part 2 of the story that was begun in the Gospel of Luke. The same person wrote Luke and Acts, and John is stuck in there between them. But Luke actually wrote those 2 books, Luke and Acts. And then we have the epistles of Paul. Romans, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians. 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. The order of these books is determined by length, first written to churches and then written to individuals. They're not chronological. They are not theological. The order is strictly determined by length. They put the longest one first, which is Romans, and the shortest one last, which is 1st Thessalonians, of course followed by 2nd Thessalonians, to the churches. And then 1st Timothy, Titus, and Philemon, which determine the order of the letters that were written to individuals. The general epistles are organized in the same fashion, longest to shortest. They're called general epistles. Hebrews and James aren't quite like epistles, but that's what we call them. Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st and 2nd, 3rd John, and Jude, and then finally the Apocalypse of Revelation, which could be traced to the authority of the Apostle John. There were very, very many apocalypses written in the ancient world. This is the one that made it into our Bibles in the New Testament. I hope that you will join me next time. We're going to look at the various types of literature that are found in the Bible. It's very helpful if we think about the kind of literature that we are reading when we pick up the Bible and read it. It will help us to understand it better. So next time, look forward to it. We will be looking at the various kinds of literature in the Bible. God bless.